Stay with me, because what happened in the next 10 seconds destroyed a woman who thought she owned the world. The mud hit her before the sound registered, a heavy splash across Emily Carter's pale blue uniform, soaking through fabric she had ironed just an hour earlier, the cold grit clinging to her skin like it belonged there, like she belonged there. She didn't scream. She didn't step back. She just froze, one hand tightening around the cleaning cloth still tucked in her pocket, her breath catching somewhere between shock and something quieter, something older. Across the curb, a white luxury SUV idled, its engine humming softly like nothing had happened, like this was just another Tuesday morning in downtown Boston. Then the door opened. Heels touched pavement first, sharp and deliberate, followed by Victoria Blake, wrapped in a cream coat that probably cost more than Emily made in 2 months, her sunglasses reflecting the stunned faces gathering around them. Victoria didn't apologize. She smiled. Not a warm smile, not even a fake one, just a small curve of satisfaction, like she had corrected something out of place. You missed a spot, she said lightly, lifting her phone, the camera already recording, already framing Emily as part of the mess. A few people laughed. Most didn't. But no one moved. Not a single hand reached out. Not a single voice said stop. Emily slowly raised her sleeve, wiping mud from her cheek, leaving a faint streak behind, her movements careful, controlled, like if she moved too fast something inside her might break. And that's when it happened. Across the street, behind tinted glass, another engine cut to silence. A black SUV, parked so still it blended into the background, suddenly became the only thing in motion. Inside, a man watched. Daniel Hayes didn't react the way others did. He didn't laugh. He didn't look away. He simply observed, his gaze steady, calculating, as if he were memorizing every second. The phone in Victoria's hand captured one version of the story. His eyes captured another. Emily bent down, reaching for the small bucket she had dropped, her fingers brushing the wet pavement, her reflection distorted in the puddle beneath her. For a moment, it looked like she might kneel. The crowd leaned in, waiting. But she didn't. She stood back up, shoulders straight, chin level, saying nothing. That silence echoed louder than anything. Victoria had said. Victoria's smile flickered, just for a second, before she turned slightly, angling her camera for a better shot. People like you, she added, almost casually, should learn where they stand. Across the street, Daniel's jaw tightened, just enough to notice if you were looking for it. And then he did something no one else did. He reached for his phone. Not to post. Not to laugh. To record. Because in that moment, while everyone else saw a cleaner girl covered in mud, he saw something else entirely. And Victoria Blake had no idea who was watching. The internet never forgets, but it decides very quickly who to remember. By the time Emily Carter finished scrubbing the last streak of mud from the sidewalk, the moment was already gone for everyone else, but not for her. And definitely not for the thousands of silent witnesses who had started to gather behind their screens. The video Victoria recorded went live within minutes, polished with a caption that felt sharper than the splash itself, something about standards and discipline and knowing your place, words that sounded harmless if you did not look closely, but cut deeper the longer you listened. Emily did not see it at first. She did not check her phone. She went back inside the building, past glass doors that reflected her stained uniform, past a receptionist who avoided eye contact, past coworkers who suddenly found something very important to look at on their desks. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, every second stretching like it was testing how much silence she could carry. On the 12th floor, her supervisor was already waiting. No greeting, no question, just a tight smile and a printed sheet of paper resting on the desk like it had been prepared in advance. "We cannot afford complaints from high-profile clients," he said, choosing each word carefully, as if he were explaining something reasonable. Emily listened, her hands still faintly damp, the smell of soap clinging to her skin. She did not argue. She did not explain. There was nothing to explain. Within 5 minutes, her badge was placed on the desk, her name removed from the schedule, her locker key returned without ceremony. Just like that, she was gone. Outside, the city moved exactly the same. Cars passed. People crossed streets. Somewhere, someone laughed. Emily stepped onto the sidewalk again. Now clean, as if nothing had happened there at all, except she knew better. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, the weight of it suddenly heavier than it should have been, and started walking without a destination, her pace steady, her eyes forward. She still had 2 more jobs to get to. She still had rent due in 6 days. She still had a younger brother waiting at home who believed everything would be okay because she always made it okay. Across town, in a quiet office lined with glass and steel, Daniel Hayes watched the same video play for the 3rd time, but not the one Victoria posted. His version was unfiltered, unedited, every second intact, including the silence after, including the moment Emily chose not to kneel. He paused it there. That single frame. A choice. His phone buzzed with notifications, messages stacking faster than he could read, but he ignored them. Instead, he tapped another screen, pulling up a different set of information entirely, building records, contracts, ownership structures, names that connected like threads most people would never notice. Victoria Blake appeared quickly, too quickly, and when she did, the room seemed to grow quieter, like something had just shifted beneath the surface. Daniel leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to show interest, not anger, not yet. "Find everything," he said calmly, his voice low, controlled, directed at no one in particular and everyone at the same time. Because while the world saw a viral clip, he saw a pattern. And patterns, when exposed at the right moment, had a way of changing everything. Power does not announce itself. It reveals itself when no one expects it. The next morning, the city woke up to a different version of the story. Not louder, not more dramatic, but sharper, cleaner, impossible to ignore. Emily Carter stood in a small kitchen, sunlight slipping through worn blinds, illuminating a chipped mug she had filled with cheap coffee that had already gone cold. Her phone sat face down on the table, buzzing every few seconds, but she did not touch it. Across from her, a stack of unpaid bills rested beside a folded medical prescription with her brother's name printed across the top. A reminder that time did not pause just because the world had decided to watch her. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, then reached for her bag. There was no time to process humiliation when survival demanded movement. Meanwhile, miles away, in a conference room lined with glass and quiet authority, Victoria Blake adjusted her reflection in a polished surface, her posture perfect, her expression composed, as if nothing from the previous day had followed her here. Around her, executives murmured, assistants moved quickly, and a large digital screen displayed projections tied to a contract worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. She had already moved on. In her world, moments like yesterday were not consequences, they were footnotes. A colleague leaned in, whispering something about increased online engagement, about her name trending, about attention being good for business. Victoria smiled faintly, accepting it as confirmation, not warning. She believed she controlled the narrative. She believed she always had. Across the same city, Daniel Hayes stood in front of another screen, but his was not filled with projections or applause. His displayed timelines, ownership maps, legal ties, a web of connections that slowly revealed the structure beneath Victoria's influence. His team moved efficiently, pulling records, verifying details, assembling pieces that did not look significant alone, but together formed something far more precise. Daniel did not rush. He watched. He listened. He waited. "Who signs her contracts?" he asked quietly, not looking away from the data. A voice answered. Another file appeared. Another connection locked into place. The room remained calm, almost silent, but the atmosphere had changed, like a storm forming without thunder. Back on the street, Emily stepped into her second job, a small diner where the smell of coffee and frying pans filled the air, grounding her in something real, something simple. The manager glanced at her uniform, at the faint discoloration that refused to fully disappear, but said nothing, just handed her an apron and pointed toward the back. Work did not ask questions. It simply demanded that you continue. Emily nodded, tying the apron with steady hands, her reflection briefly catching in a stainless steel surface. For a second, she saw herself the way the world had seen her yesterday. Then she blinked, and it was gone. She picked up a tray. She kept moving, because she always did. And somewhere else, in a building she had never entered, decisions were being made that would soon reach her without warning. Daniel finally leaned back, his eyes settling on a single name, a single contract, a single event scheduled for that evening, one that Victoria Blake believed would secure her position permanently. His fingers tapped once against the table, a quiet signal. "Prepare the presentation," he said calmly. No raised voice. No urgency. Just certainty. Because some consequences do not arrive immediately. They arrive exactly when they are meant to be seen. The higher someone stands, the further their fall can be seen. By late afternoon, the city's skyline reflected gold against glass towers, and inside one of them, everything was moving exactly as planned, at least on the surface. Victoria Blake stepped into the event hall with the same controlled confidence she had carried all day, her heels echoing softly against polished marble, her reflection trailing beside her in endless mirrored panels. Staff greeted her with practiced smiles, assistants adjusted final details, and a large banner stretched across the far wall, announcing a partnership that promised expansion, influence, and numbers that sounded almost unreal to anyone outside that room. Cameras were already in place. Guests were arriving. This was the kind of moment that defined reputations. Victoria paused briefly near the entrance, smoothing her sleeve, her expression calm, untouched by anything that had happened the day before. To her, that moment was already behind her, already smaller than the future she believed she was stepping into. Across the room, executives gathered in small clusters, their voices low but excited, conversations filled with projections, timelines, and expectations. One of them mentioned the online buzz again, the increased attention, the engagement metrics that had surged overnight. Victoria acknowledged it with a slight nod, accepting it as confirmation that visibility, no matter the source, could always be turned into advantage. She believed she was still in control of the narrative. She believed the world moved in response to people like her. Meanwhile, several floors above, in a quieter space far removed from the polished energy of the event, Daniel Hayes stood alone for a moment, looking out over the same city from a different angle. The glass in front of him reflected both the skyline and his own still expression, a dual image that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. Behind him, a screen displayed the final sequence prepared for the evening, a collection of footage, documents, and connections arranged with precise intention. Every detail had been verified. Every step had been timed. There was no rush in his movements, no visible urgency, only a steady progression towards something inevitable. A soft knock broke the silence. "Everything is ready," a voice said. Daniel did not turn immediately. He let the moment settle, then nodded once, a small motion that carried quiet authority. "Good," he replied. Down below, the event continued to build, lights brightening, music beginning to fill the space, the atmosphere shifting from preparation to performance. Victoria moved toward the stage area, her posture flawless, her smile returning as she greeted key partners, her voice smooth, practiced, confident. This was her environment. This was where she excelled. Across the city, in a small diner that smelled of coffee and late afternoon rush, Emily Carter carried a tray between tables, her steps steady, her focus fixed on simple tasks that did not require explanation or defense. She had not seen the event announcements. She had not checked the trending videos. Her world, for now, remained grounded in what she could control, what she could complete, what she could endure. A customer thanked her. She nodded quietly. The moment passed, and somewhere between those two worlds, unseen but moving closer with every second, a decision was about to cross the distance between them. Back at the venue, the lights dimmed slightly as the host stepped forward, introducing the partnership, the names, the significance of what was about to be signed. Applause began to rise, building in waves. Victoria stepped toward the center, ready to claim the moment she believed belonged to her. And above it all, behind a screen not yet illuminated, something else waited, something that would not interrupt immediately, but would arrive at exactly the right second, when the room was watching most closely. The moment everyone applauds is often the moment everything begins to change. The room was alive now, filled with polished voices, soft laughter, and the low hum of success being celebrated in real time, the kind of atmosphere where every detail had been rehearsed and nothing was supposed to go wrong. Victoria Blake stood under the stage lights, her silhouette sharp against the glowing backdrop, her name already echoing through the speakers as the host praised her leadership, her vision, her ability to turn opportunity into dominance. Applause followed, steady and approving, the kind that reassured rather than questioned. She stepped forward with perfect timing, her smile measured, her eyes scanning the room just enough to acknowledge importance without appearing to seek it. In her hand, a sleek pen waited, poised above a document that represented months of negotiation, years of positioning, and a future she believed was already secured. Cameras angled toward her. Phones lifted. This was the image that would circulate, not the one from yesterday. This was the version of the story she intended the world to remember. In the back of the room, a large screen remained dark, its surface reflecting fragments of movement, silhouettes shifting as people adjusted their positions for a better view. No one paid attention to it. Not yet. The host continued speaking, words flowing smoothly, building anticipation, guiding the room toward the exact second that mattered. And now, he said, pausing just long enough to let the moment settle, we invite Miss Blake to finalize this partnership. The applause rose again, louder this time, filling the space with certainty. Victoria lowered her gaze briefly, aligning the pen with the signature line, her posture unwavering, her confidence absolute. For a fraction of a second, everything aligned exactly as she had planned. Then something changed. It was subtle at first, almost invisible, a flicker of light behind her, a shift in the room's attention that did not yet have a name. The large screen came to life without announcement, its brightness cutting through the polished atmosphere like a quiet interruption that refused to stay quiet. Conversations faltered. Applause thinned. A few heads turned, then more, until the movement spread across the room like a ripple no one had intended to create. Victoria paused, pen hovering just above the paper, her expression holding steady for 1 second longer than it should have. Behind her, the screen did not show projections or branding or any of the visuals prepared for the event. It showed something else, something familiar, a city street, a moment frozen just before impact. The image sharpened. The sound followed. A splash. Not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The room went still in a way that applause never could achieve. Victoria did not turn immediately. She did not need to. The shift in the air told her everything had changed. In the back of the room, a single figure stepped forward from the shadows of the crowd, moving with quiet precision, not rushing, not hesitating, as if every step had already been decided long before this moment began. Daniel Hayes did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The room was already listening. On the screen, the moment replayed, unedited, unfiltered, every detail intact, including the silence that followed, including the part no one had noticed before. The part where the story did not end the way it was supposed to. Victoria slowly straightened, the pen still in her hand, her reflection now split between the polished stage in front of her and the truth unfolding behind her. And for the first time since she stepped into that room, she was no longer controlling what people were watching. When the truth finally appears, it does not ask for permission. The screen held the room hostage, every frame unfolding with quiet precision, each second stretching longer than it should, as if time itself had slowed just to make sure no one could look away. The sound of the city street filled the silence, the soft hum of traffic, the distant footsteps, and then that unmistakable moment, the splash that had once seemed small now echoing across a room filled with people who understood exactly what it meant. No music, no commentary, just reality, unfiltered and impossible to reshape. Victoria Blake remained still, her hand tightening ever so slightly around the pen, her posture still composed but no longer effortless. The reflection of the screen flickered across her face, revealing something new, something she had not prepared for. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The kind that arrives when control slips without warning. Around her, the audience shifted, the energy transforming from admiration to uncertainty, from certainty to quiet calculation. Phones that had once been raised to capture her success were now angled toward the screen, toward the version of her that could not be explained away with polished words or strategic smiles. The host, who had stood confidently moments before, stepped back without instruction, instinctively removing himself from a moment that no longer belonged to him. In the center of it all, Daniel Hayes moved forward, each step measured, deliberate, his presence cutting through the confusion without needing to demand attention. He did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt the footage. He simply allowed it to continue, because the truth, when given space, had a way of speaking louder than anything else. The video reached its final seconds, the moment where most people had stopped watching, but Daniel had not. The moment where Emily Carter chose not to kneel, where she stood instead, silent, steady, refusing to become what the situation demanded. The screen paused on that image. A choice. A line that had not been crossed. Daniel turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, not searching, not questioning, simply observing the shift that had already taken place. This partnership, he said calmly, his voice carrying without force, was built on a standard. No accusation, no raised tone, just a statement. The kind that left no room for interpretation. A murmur moved through the audience, quiet but undeniable, as understanding began to settle in places where certainty had existed minutes before. Victoria finally turned, slowly, facing the screen behind her, facing the image she could no longer avoid. For a moment, she looked at it the way everyone else did, not as the person who had lived it, but as someone seeing it for the first time. The distance between those two perspectives was where everything changed. Daniel continued, his tone unchanged, steady, controlled. And standards are not defined by success, he added, letting the words settle before continuing. They are defined by what you do when no one is supposed to be watching. The room remained silent, not because it had been told to be, but because there was nothing left to say that could compete with what had already been shown. The contract on the table no longer looked like an achievement. It looked like a question. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Blake did not have an answer. Silence is not empty. It is where judgment begins. The room did not erupt. It did not collapse into chaos. It simply shifted, a subtle but irreversible change that moved through every person standing there, replacing admiration with distance, confidence with caution, and applause with something far colder. Victoria Blake remained at the center, but the space around her no longer belonged to her. It widened, almost imperceptibly, as people adjusted their stance, their gaze, their alignment, creating an invisible boundary that had not existed moments before. The contract on the table remained unsigned, the pen still in her hand, but its weight had changed, no longer a symbol of control, but of hesitation. She opened her mouth slightly, as if to speak, to explain, to redirect the narrative back into something manageable, something familiar, but no words came out that could compete with what had already been seen. Because explanation requires belief, and belief had already begun to dissolve. Daniel Hayes did not move closer. He did not need to. His presence had already expanded beyond physical distance, anchored in the certainty of what had been revealed. Behind him, the screen remained frozen on that single frame. Emily Carter standing still, not defeated, not defiant, simply refusing to become smaller than the moment demanded. It was not dramatic. That was why it mattered. Around the room, conversations resumed, but not the same ones, not about projections or partnerships, but quieter, sharper exchanges, names being reconsidered, decisions being recalculated in real time. A senior executive leaned toward another, his voice low but urgent. "We did not review this." Another shook his head slightly, eyes fixed on the screen, as if trying to understand how something so small could suddenly outweigh something so large. Because that was the shift no one had prepared for. Scale no longer protected perception. Victoria finally lowered the pen, placing it carefully on the table, her movements controlled, deliberate, but no longer confident in the same way. She turned fully now, not toward the audience, not toward the contract, but toward Daniel. For the first time, she was not being observed as the center of attention, she was being evaluated. And that difference carried weight she could feel, but not control. "This is out of context," she said, her voice steady, practiced, reaching for authority that had always worked before. It was not loud. It did not need to be. But it landed differently now, not as a correction, but as an attempt. Daniel did not respond immediately. He allowed the words to exist in the space, to settle, to be measured against what everyone had already seen. Then he took a single step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to make it clear that the moment had not passed. "Context," he repeated quietly, his tone even, almost reflective, as if considering the word itself, "is exactly what we are looking at. No emphasis, no escalation, just clarity." The room absorbed it. Victoria's gaze held his for a second longer, searching for something, leverage, recognition, an opening, but there was none offered. Around them, the audience was no longer passive. They were deciding. And decisions, once made in silence, rarely reversed. Somewhere in the back, a phone vibrated. Then another, notifications spreading beyond the walls of the room, carrying the moment outward, multiplying it, ensuring that what had happened here would not remain contained. And as that realization settled, not just on Victoria, but on everyone present, the balance of the room shifted completely. Because control, once lost in front of witnesses, does not return quietly. It changes hands. Reputation is not destroyed in a moment. It is revealed in one. The air in the room had changed completely now, no longer warm with celebration, but cool with calculation. Every person present silently adjusting their understanding of what they were witnessing, not just a failed moment, but a shift in power unfolding in real time. Victoria Blake stood perfectly still, but the stillness no longer felt controlled. It felt measured, as if every movement now carried consequences she had not anticipated. Around her, the quiet conversations deepened, more deliberate, more decisive, voices lowered but sharper, no longer asking what had happened, but what it meant. A man near the front adjusted his tie, glancing toward his colleague before speaking under his breath. "We cannot move forward with this." Another nodded, not surprised, only confirming what had already become obvious. The contract on the table was no longer an opportunity, it was a risk. And risk, in rooms like this, was something that disappeared quickly. Victoria's gaze shifted across the audience, searching for alignment, for support, for anyone still standing where they had been minutes ago, but the faces she met were no longer familiar in the same way. Some avoided her eyes entirely. Others looked directly, but without the approval she expected. It was not hostility. It was distance, the kind that could not be argued with. On the screen behind her, the paused image remained unchanged, a quiet reminder that could not be undone, could not be reframed, could not be negotiated. Daniel Hayes remained where he was, not stepping forward again, not pressing the moment further, because he did not need to. The room was doing the work for him now. A senior partner cleared his throat, stepping slightly toward the stage, his presence enough to signal a shift in authority. "We will need to review this internally," he said, his tone formal, controlled, but unmistakably final in its direction. It was not a rejection spoken loudly. It was something more definitive. A pause that meant no. Victoria listened, her expression tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing again, her composure returning out of habit, even as the foundation beneath it continued to shift. "This is being misinterpreted," she replied, her voice steady, still reaching for control, still structured, still precise. But the room no longer responded to structure. It responded to what it had seen. Another voice joined, from the side this time, less formal, more direct. "It is clear enough. No accusation, no emotion, just conclusion. The kind that closed doors without needing to slam them." In that moment, the applause from earlier felt distant, almost unreal, like something that had belonged to a different room entirely. Victoria's hand moved slightly, not toward the pen, but away from it, creating a small but visible distance between herself and the document she had been about to sign. It was subtle, but in a room trained to read signals, it was unmistakable. Across the space, phones continued to light up, messages spreading, updates moving faster than any statement could contain them, ensuring that what was happening here would not remain private, would not be softened, would not be forgotten. And somewhere, in a small diner across town, Emily Carter wiped down a table, unaware that the moment she had already endured was now rewriting something far beyond her reach. Back in the hall, Victoria Blake stood surrounded by people, but no longer supported by them, her position unchanged physically, but entirely altered in meaning. Because the difference between being seen and being understood had just become impossible to ignore. And once that line is crossed, there is no returning to the version of the story that existed before. The real cost of a moment is never paid all at once. The event did not end with a dramatic announcement or a visible collapse. It dissolved, slowly and quietly, the way confidence leaves a room when no one is willing to stand behind it anymore. Conversations broke into smaller fragments, Groups shifted, some guests stepped away entirely, their exits subtle but deliberate, as if distance itself was the safest decision they could make. Victoria Blake remained where she was, but the space around her continued to widen, not physically, but in meaning. Each passing second reinforcing the separation between who she had been at the start of the evening and who she now appeared to be. The screen behind her eventually dimmed, returning to black, but the image it had displayed did not disappear. It lingered in the minds of everyone present, sharper than any branding that had been planned for the night. Daniel Hayes did not linger on the stage. Once the shift had completed, once the room had made its decision without needing instruction, he stepped back, his role in the moment already finished. He did not need to confirm the outcome. It was already visible in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way conversations redirected, in the way authority had quietly moved away from Victoria without a single formal declaration. Near the front, one of the senior executives closed the folder containing the contract, the soft sound of paper meeting paper carrying more finality than any spoken rejection. "We will be in touch," he said, a phrase that sounded polite, but carried a meaning everyone in the room understood. It was over. Victoria listened, her posture still upright, her expression still controlled, but something beneath it had shifted permanently, a recognition that this was not a misunderstanding that could be corrected, not a narrative that could be rewritten with better wording or strategic timing. This was exposure. And exposure, once public, does not retreat. Across the room, a few remaining cameras captured fragments of the aftermath, not the moment of success they had expected, but something quieter, more telling, the subtle unraveling of a position that had once seemed unshakable. Phones continued to vibrate, notifications multiplying, the story extending far beyond the walls of the building, reaching audiences who had not been present but were now watching anyway, forming opinions, drawing conclusions, creating a second layer of consequence that no one in the room could contain. Miles away, the diner grew busier as evening approached, the sound of plates and conversations filling the space with a different kind of rhythm, one grounded in routine rather than reputation. Emily Carter moved between tables with the same steady pace, her focus unchanged, her hands occupied with tasks that required attention but not explanation. She still had not checked her phone. She still did not know. And yet, something had already begun to change around her, subtle at first. A shift in the way one customer looked at her a second longer than usual, a glance from the manager that held curiosity instead of indifference, small signals that something beyond her awareness was moving closer. Back at the venue, Victoria Blake finally stepped away from the center of the room, her heels no longer echoing with the same certainty, her movement no longer commanding attention but passing through it. No one stopped her. No one followed. The room continued without her, adjusting, recalibrating, as if she had already become part of something that had happened rather than something that was still happening. And in that quiet transition, one truth settled firmly into place, not spoken, not announced, but understood by everyone who had witnessed it. Influence can build over years, but it can shift in a single moment, especially when the wrong person is watching at exactly the right time. Some endings do not arrive with noise. They arrive with decisions made in silence. By the time Victoria Blake reached the lobby, the building no longer felt like a place she controlled. It felt like a place she was leaving behind, each step across the polished floor carrying less certainty than the one before. The revolving doors opened with the same smooth precision as always, but the air outside felt different, cooler, sharper, as if the city itself had already adjusted to the shift that had taken place inside. Her phone vibrated again in her hand, not once, not twice, but continuously, messages stacking faster than she could read, names she recognized, numbers she valued, all reaching out at the same time, not to congratulate, not to confirm, but to question, to distance, to reconsider. She did not answer. Not yet. Across the street, a digital billboard flickered, its content shifting between advertisements and trending clips, and for a brief second, too brief for most to notice but long enough for her to see, the image appeared, a still frame pulled from the video, unmistakable, unavoidable. She looked away immediately, but the recognition had already settled. This was no longer contained. This was no longer controlled. Miles away, inside the diner, The evening rush had reached its peak, the sound of plates, orders, and overlapping conversations filling the space with a steady rhythm that left no room for distraction. Emily Carter moved through it all with quiet focus, balancing trays, refilling cups, her movements efficient, practiced, grounded in repetition. "Hey," a coworker said as she passed, holding up a phone with a half-curious, half-uncertain expression. "Is this you?" Emily paused, just for a second, the question catching her off guard, not because of what it asked, but because of how it was asked, carefully, almost cautiously. She wiped her hands on her apron before taking the phone, her fingers steady, her expression neutral as the screen lit up. The video played without warning. The splash. The silence. The moment she had already lived now replaying from a perspective she had never seen. She watched it once. Then she handed the phone back. No reaction. No comment. Just a small nod as if acknowledging something that no longer required explanation. "I am fine," she said quietly, her voice even, not defensive, not dismissive, just certain. Then she turned and continued working, picking up another tray, moving forward the same way she always had. But something had changed, not in her movement, not in her expression, but in the way the room around her responded. Conversations softened slightly as she passed. A customer who had barely noticed her earlier now offered a quiet thank you with a different tone. The manager watched her from behind the counter, his expression no longer indifferent, something closer to consideration forming in its place. Back outside, Victoria stood beside her car, the city moving around her as if nothing had happened, but everything had. She finally looked at her phone, scrolling through messages that no longer carried the same certainty, headlines forming in real time, words like conduct, accountability, review, each one reshaping the narrative she had once controlled. Across town, in a quiet office above the city, Daniel Hayes stood by the window once more, the reflection of the skyline stretching across the glass, his phone resting untouched on the desk behind him. He did not check the reactions. He did not need to. The outcome had already begun. And as the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the precise moment everything had shifted, one truth moved quietly through all three of their worlds, connecting them without their consent. What happens in public may begin with a single act, but its consequences travel far beyond the moment, reaching people who never asked to be part of the story and changing paths that had already been set in motion. Sometimes the person who stays quiet is the one the world eventually listens to. The diner slowed as the night stretched on, the rush fading into a softer rhythm of scattered conversations and half-empty coffee cups, the kind of quiet that revealed more than noise ever could. Emily Carter wiped down the counter, her movement steady, unchanged, but the air around her had shifted in ways she could not ignore anymore. People looked at her differently now, not with pity, not even with sympathy, but with recognition, the kind that carries questions without asking them out loud. A man at the end of the counter hesitated before speaking, his voice careful, almost respectful. "That was not right," he said, not referencing the video directly, but meaning it entirely. Emily paused, just for a fraction of a second, then gave a small nod, not agreeing, not disagreeing, simply acknowledging that something had been seen. "Thank you," she replied softly, her tone even, her focus returning to the task in front of her. Because for her, the moment had already passed. She had lived it, survived it, moved through it. The world was just catching up. Behind the counter, the manager approached, his usual authority replaced with something more measured, more thoughtful. He cleared his throat lightly, glancing at her before speaking. "Emily," he said, slower than usual, as if choosing each word with intention. "If you need time off, or anything at all, just let me know." The offer was simple, but the meaning behind it carried weight. It was not policy. It was response. Emily looked at him, really looked this time, seeing the shift not just in tone, but in understanding. "I am okay," she said, and this time there was something more in her voice, not strength, not defiance, but certainty. The kind that does not need to prove itself. Across the city, Victoria Blake sat in the back of her car, the interior silent except for the faint vibration of her phone, which she had finally placed face down beside her, unable to keep up with the messages that no longer sounded like support. The driver kept his eyes forward, the city lights passing in reflections across the window, breaking her image into fragments that did not align the way they used to. She leaned back slightly, her posture still composed, but the stillness now felt different, heavier, as if it required effort to maintain. For the first time in a long time, she was not planning her next move. She was trying to understand the one that had already happened. A single moment. That was all it had taken. Not years. Not a scandal built over time. Just one decision, made casually, publicly, without hesitation, now expanding into consequences she could not predict, could not contain. Across another part of the city, Daniel Hayes remained in his office, the lights dimmed, the skyline reflecting against the glass behind him, his silhouette steady, unchanged. He did not celebrate. He did not follow the reactions. He simply observed the pattern completing itself, the natural outcome of something that had already been set in motion. His phone buzzed once, then again, but he ignored it, his attention fixed on something else entirely, something beyond the moment, beyond the reaction. Because for him, this had never been about exposure. It had been about alignment. And now, the alignment had begun. Back in the diner, Emily finished her shift, removing her apron, folding it neatly, placing it exactly where it belonged, the same way she did every night. Nothing about her routine had changed. And yet, everything around her had. As she stepped outside, the cool air met her face, the city stretching out in front of her, unchanged on the surface, but different beneath it. She did not look at her phone. She did not search for the video again. She simply started walking, the same steady pace, the same quiet presence. Because some people do not need the world to validate what they already know. And sometimes, the person who was never meant to be seen becomes the one no one can ignore. Not every ending is loud. Some endings are quiet enough to be mistaken for a beginning. The night had settled over the city, wrapping buildings in glass reflections and distant lights, the kind of calm that only comes after something unseen has already shifted beneath the surface. Emily Carter walked along the sidewalk with the same steady pace, her steps measured, her posture unchanged, but the world around her no longer moved past her the same way. A car slowed slightly as it passed, not enough to interrupt traffic, just enough for someone inside to look twice. A passerby hesitated before opening a door, holding it for her without a word, a small gesture, but different from the indifference she had known before. She noticed it, but she did not react. Not outwardly. Because attention, like silence, can be loud in its own way. Across town, Victoria Blake stood alone in a high-rise office that still carried her name on the door, but the space felt unfamiliar now, as if ownership had shifted without paperwork, without announcement. The city stretched out behind her in perfect lines and distant lights, but she was not looking at it the way she used to. Her phone lay on the desk, screen dimmed, notifications waiting, decisions waiting, consequences waiting, all of them requiring something she had not needed before. Consideration. She walked slowly across the room, her heels softer now against the floor, stopping in front of a glass panel that reflected her image back at her, not distorted, not broken, just different in a way she could not ignore. For years, she had understood control as something you held. Tonight, she understood it as something you could lose without warning. And once lost, it did not return the same way. Somewhere else in the city, in a quiet office where the lights remained low, Daniel Hayes reviewed a final set of documents, not with urgency, not with satisfaction, but with precision. Names had been removed. Agreements reconsidered. Alignments adjusted. Not as punishment, not as reaction, but as correction. He signed nothing himself. He did not need to. His influence moved through systems, not announcements, through decisions made by others who had already seen enough. He closed the file and set it aside, the action small, but complete. Because the outcome was no longer a question. It was already in motion. Back on the street, Emily reached her building, an older structure with worn steps and a flickering light above the entrance, the kind of place that did not promise anything except shelter. She paused for a moment before going inside, not because she was unsure, but because the night felt different, quieter, as if something had settled into place without asking for her permission. She exhaled slowly, then stepped forward, opening the door with the same familiarity as always. Inside, nothing had changed. The hallway was the same. The walls were the same. The life waiting for her upstairs was the same. And yet, Something beyond those walls had shifted in a way she could not fully see, but would eventually feel. Because change does not always arrive where it begins. Sometimes it travels, quietly, patiently, until it reaches the person who never asked for it. And as the city continued its rhythm, unaware of the exact moment everything had been set into motion, one truth remained, steady and undeniable. The people who act without thinking often believe the moment ends when they walk away. But the moment does not end. It moves. It grows. And eventually, it returns. In the end, the truth does not raise its voice. It simply remains. Morning arrived without ceremony. The city waking the same way it always did, traffic building, doors opening, lives continuing as if nothing had shifted, but beneath that surface, something had settled into place, quiet and permanent. Emily Carter stood by her small kitchen window, the early light resting gently across the table, her phone lying untouched beside her, still carrying notifications she had not fully explored. She did not rush to read them. She did not search for updates. Instead, she focused on something simpler, pouring a cup of coffee, adjusting the sleeve of her uniform, preparing for another day that, on the outside, looked exactly like the one before. But there was a difference now, not in what she did, but in what followed her. Recognition had found her, not loudly, not overwhelmingly, but steadily, in small moments that continued to appear without invitation. As she stepped outside, a neighbor who had never spoken before gave a quiet nod. A passerby offered a brief smile. Nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just a shift. Across the city, Victoria Blake sat at the same desk that had once represented control, but the space felt different now, not because anything had been removed, but because something had been revealed. The silence in the room was no longer strategic. It was reflective. Files remained where they had been placed. Messages waited where they had been left. But the decisions connected to them had already begun to move in directions she did not guide. She looked out over the skyline again, but this time, she was not measuring it. She was understanding it differently. Influence, she realized, was not built only on power. It was built on perception. And perception, once changed, does not return unchanged. Somewhere, above it all, in an office that remained untouched by noise, Daniel Hayes stood by the glass once more, his reflection steady against the city he had already moved through without being seen. He did not revisit the moment. He did not follow the aftermath. Because for him, the purpose had never been the reaction. It had been the correction. And now, that correction had extended beyond a single room, beyond a single contract, into something quieter, more lasting. Back on the street, Emily walked toward her day, her steps the same, her pace unchanged, her presence still as quiet as it had always been. But now, when people looked at her, they did not look through her. They saw her, not because she demanded it, not because she asked for it, but because something had forced the world to notice what had always been there. She reached the corner where everything had started, the pavement clean now, no trace of what had happened except the memory carried by those who had seen it, those who had shared it, those who had learned from it. She paused for just a moment, not to relive it, not to question it, but simply to stand where it had happened and recognize that she had never been what that moment tried to make her. Then she continued walking, forward, without hesitation. Because some people do not need to change after being seen. They only need the world to catch up. And somewhere, carried quietly through conversations, decisions, and silent understandings, the lesson remained, not spoken, not announced, but impossible to ignore. Some people lose everything they thought they owned, just to learn what dignity was worth all along.